no regrets, no confusion. There'll be no pollution. I'm so thankful I've decided to change my ways.
Welcome back to the Leaving Eden podcast. We are your hosts. My name's Gavi, here with my BFF, Sadie Carpenter, cult expert, cult survivor. Sadie Carpenter, how are you doing today?
Doing great. How are you?
I am feeling good. I am feeling fine. Life is so indeed divine. Today, we're talking about something that is not indeed divine. We're talking about like authoritarian leaders. We're talking about dictators, and we're talking about how a authoritarian regime can turn a country into essentially a cult. Like a country can essentially function as a cult. And I think that is an interesting topic that I'm excited to talk about. And I've been begging kind of Sadie to do this episode for several months, but now we're finally getting to it.
Well, I'm glad we're finally getting to it. I'm very interested to hear your research on this.
I don't know. You weren't like skeptical on it, but you were just like, I need to see it in.
Mm-hmm. Like when I write an episode, I write it based on a storyline. Like I think of it like a novel or a movie, like in the terms of story beats. And when you are the primary person setting up an episode, like we're going to talk about this and then that and then this other thing, I don't see it the way I see it in my head when I'm the lead person on writing the story of an episode. So sometimes I think I come off as skeptical, but I really just need you to show like how you're going to get from point A to point B. And once you showed me on this episode, I got on board very quickly.
Yeah. I mean, I think of episodes more in terms of like, as if I'm like writing a 5-paragraph essay for college. Because that's what I did a lot of when I was in college. And you're like trying to tell a story here. So, but hey, that's why this show is fun. So today we're going to be talking about that. We're going to be talking about, authoritarian leaders. We're going to be talking about people like Hitler, Stalin, Mao, Pol Pot, a few others in there, thrown in as well. Maybe some Putin. We're not talking about Trump today. But yeah, anyway, before we get into that, the Leaving Eden podcast is the podcast about my BFF and co-host Sadie Carpenter's life in and escape from the independent fundamental Baptist cult, the cult in which she was raised. We talk about this cult. We talk about other cults. We talk about religion. We talk about fundamentalism. We talk about the real and present threat that cults and cult ideologies pose to society as a whole. And it is our goal to promote freedom of mind, freedom of thought, and freedom of religion. So if you like our show, if you are a fan of our show, then you can check out our Patreon, where there is going to be an extended and uncensored and ad-free version of today's episode that will be available at patreon.com/Leaving Eden podcast. Also on the Patreon is extended versions of our other episodes and some bonus content that you may find appealing. Should be fun. You can also join our Facebook group and our subreddit. Both of those are called Eden Exodus. I guess that's all we've got to say. We're going to thank the patrons now. So
All right. Our I Gave It All to Your patrons are Kathleen Moncrief, Melissa Manown, Melora King, and Todd Dale on behalf of his spouse, Madeline Antrim. Thank you so much to the I Gave It All to Your patrons. The Faith Promise Missions tier patrons are Alex P., Alicia Guild, Ali Allen, Chrissa Walker, Dora J., Eleanor Donahue, Hannah Ross, Hope Norum, Horton Here's a Shane, Janine Callan, Jana Connor, Jen Kaharski, Jessica Tambo, Jonna, Junie B. Jones, and the B stands for Backstreet's Back. Gabi, you're supposed to say, all right. Kat Hinwood, Kay Terwee, Kristen Marie, Learned Vixen, Linda Morgan, Madeline Antrim, Madeline Cusick, Maddie the Seventh Day Badventist, Mary Martin, Maybe I'm 1010, Megan Arndt, Rob the Methodist, Stephanie Johnson, Steve and Amy, Susie, Tara McNamara, Wes the Cowboy, and Zoe Shuck. Thank you so much to everyone who supports us at the Faith Promise Missions tier, the I Gave It All tier, and at any tier over on Patreon. And of course, as always, thank you to the people who support us in non-financial ways as well. Those of you who share about us on social media, recommend us to people you think might be interested, leave us a positive review on wherever you listen to your podcasts. All of those things have a very real impact, and we are so thankful. In general, we talk about a lot of potentially triggering topics on our show, including but not limited to suicide and mental health, racism, misogyny, PTSD and PTSD symptoms, child abuse, mental, physical, and sexual abuse, and spiritual abuse, including guilt, shame, and fear. In most episodes, we will mention at least a few of these topics, but we try to avoid any graphic detail unless it's relevant to the story that we're telling, and we do our best to give the audience a heads up before we get into that kind of detail if we do feel it's necessary for an episode.
Okay, so I am going to start off by telling a completely true story that took place in a high school in Palo Alto, California in 1967. Ron Jones was a history teacher at Cubberley High School in Palo Alto, California. One day, Mr. Jones was having difficulty trying to explain to his 10th grade class, world history class, how the German people could have been so amenable to the rise of Nazism. And so he decided to engage them with a social experiment. The next Monday, when the students came into class, their seating was rearranged, and written on the chalkboard was strength through discipline. Mr. Jones then started enforcing strict classroom discipline on his students. He expected them to sit at attention as soon as they sat down. He expected them to stand up before addressing him, and he expected to end every statement with Mr. Jones. So they'd say, he asked them a question. They'd say, "This is the answer, Mr. Jones." He then lectured on the importance of discipline in all aspects of life, how painters and ballet dancers devote many hours a day for countless years to perfecting their craft, how scientists and researchers devote years and years and years to researching a specific topic or subject to find truth. I'm going to read directly from Ron Jones' firsthand account of this experiment, which he published in 1972, 5 years after it actually took place. I'd highly recommend reading this. I'm going to have this linked in our sources for this episode. But this is what he had to say. He says, "We practiced this new attention position over and over. I walked up and down the aisles of seated students, pointing out small flaws, making improvements. Proper seating became the most important aspect of learning. I would dismiss the class, allowing them to leave their desks, and then call them abruptly back to an attention seating position. In speed drills, the class learned to move from standing position to attention sitting in 15 seconds. In focus drills, I concentrated attention on the feet being parallel and flat, ankles locked, knees bent at 90-degree angles, hands flat and crossed against the desk, spine straight, chin down, head forward. We did noise drills in which talking was allowed to be shown as a distraction. Following minutes of progressive drill assignments, the class could move from standing positions outside the room to attention sitting positions at their desks without making a sound. The maneuver took 5 seconds. This was intended to be just like a one-day experiment, but the students took to it so enthusiastically that Mr. Jones decided to continue the experiment further. On Tuesday, when Mr. Jones entered the classroom, he found his students sitting at attention just as he had instructed them to the previous day. On the chalkboard below strength through discipline, he wrote strength through community. In this class period, he sermonized about the value of community and taught them a hand gesture that he called the third wave salute, thereby naming his movement the third wave. On the third day, Mr. Jones wrote on the chalkboard strength through action. This day's class was unusually large due to the fact that 13 students had skipped other classes in order to join in on Mr. Jones' third wave movement. Mr. Jones lectured that discipline and community were meaningless without action. And Ron Jones writes, I reminded students of what it felt like being in classes where competition caused pain and degradation. Situations in which students were pitted against each other in everything from gym to reading. The feeling of never acting, never being a part of something, never supporting each other. At this point, students stood without prompting and began to give what amounted to testimonials. Mr. Jones, for the first time, I'm learning a lot of things. Mr. Jones, why don't you teach like this all the time? So several students were tasked with designing the Third Wave's banner. Several students were assigned the task of making sure that nobody from outside the class entered the classroom. Some were assigned the task of learning to recite from memory every Third Wave member. Some of them were assigned the task of teaching 20 children from a neighboring elementary school why the Third Wave way of sitting at attention was superior for learning. All students were assigned a task giving Ron Jones the name and address of one reliable friend or family member who might be interested in joining the Third Wave. 3 of the 43 students present were secretly assigned the responsibility to report to him if any of their classmates were breaking the Third Wave's rules. While only 3 were given this assignment, about 20 reported to Mr. Jones that there were slackers, skeptics, and dissenters in the mix. 3 women, who Mr. Jones described as the most intelligent in the class, told their parents what was going on. This became a cause for concern. Mr. Jones received a phone call from a local rabbi about his experiment, to whom Mr. Jones assured that it was nothing more than an experiment. At this point, however, things had begun to get out of hand. Students who really bought in were bullying students who were more lax about the rules. Average or outcast students found a sense of belonging in the forced equality. One student offered to be Mr. Jones' bodyguard and to follow him around the school, opening doors for him. This was heavily weighing on Mr. Jones as he was figuring out how to conclude the experiment. He would not be able to let this experiment run its course because he was already completely out of control of what was going on. The father of one of his students, who was a retired Air Force colonel and former prisoner of war, broke into Mr. Jones' classroom, ransacked the place, and confronted Mr. Jones about friends that he had lost in the war. Other teachers' classes were being disrupted. More and more students were skipping their classes to attend Mr. Jones' class, which by this time had swelled to more than 80 students. In his class period on Thursday, Mr. Jones lectured, "The Third Wave isn't just an experiment or classroom activity. It's far more important than that. The Third Wave is a nationwide program to find students who are willing to fight for political change in this country." That's right. This activity we have been doing has been practice for the real thing. Across the country, teachers like myself have been recruiting and training a youth brigade capable of showing the nation a better society through discipline, community, pride, and action. If we can change the way that a school is run, we can change the way factories, stores, universities, and all the other institutions are run. You are a selected group of young people chosen to help us in this case. If you will stand up and display what you have learned in the past 4 days, we can change the destiny of this nation. We can bring it a new sense of order, community, pride, and action, a new purpose. Everything rests with you and your willingness to take a stand. Whew.
I have heard some speeches like that.
Haven't
a
we
few
all?
good times.
Jones goes on to say, "I explained how at noon on Friday, a national candidate for president would announce the formation of a Third Wave youth program. Simultaneous to this announcement, over 1,000 youth groups from every part of the country would stand up and display their support for such a movement. I confided that they were the students selected to represent their area. I also questioned if they could make a good showing because the press had been invited to record the event. No one laughed." This is
That's
so-
interesting. I have thoughts about that.
Yeah, I can't wait to hear them. So Friday was the final day of this week-long exercise. Mr. Jones prepared the auditorium and enlisted help of some of his friends to pose as reporters. Mr. Jones had the students demonstrate their loyalty by giving the third wave salute and chanting their mantra, strength through discipline, strength through community, strength through action. At 12:05, Mr. Jones switched on a television, but the broadcast was nothing but a blank screen. The students stared fixedly at the blank screen for 2 minutes until one person shouted, "There isn't any leader, is there?" At this point, Mr. Jones switched off the television and revealed to them that there was no leader. There was no third wave movement and that they had all been manipulated. He then switched on a projector upon which played footage of the Nuremberg rally, in which Adolf Hitler spoke to a loving crowd of Nazi devotees in his demagoguery and promised to bring about a political revolution. After the film reel had finished, Mr. Jones addressed his students. "If our enactment of the fascist mentality is complete, not one of you will ever admit to being at this final third wave rally. Like the Germans, you will have trouble admitting to yourself that you have come this far. You will not allow your friends and parents to know that you were willing to give up individual freedom and power for the dictates of order and unseen leaders. You can't admit to being manipulated, being a follower, to accepting the third wave as a way of life. You won't admit to participating in this madness. You will keep this day and this rally a secret. It's a secret I shall share with you." And at that point, he destroyed all of the footage that supposedly the fake news reporters had been taking and told them that he would keep their secret. So Sadie, I'm curious, what do you make of this story? Do you see any parallels between this and the way that you were raised?
So there's obviously a surface level connection because the third wave was a strict authoritarian way of life imposed onto people, but cleverly disguised as a lifestyle that people can choose. Students were manipulated into believing in this way of life and thinking that they were willingly choosing it. Not only that, but students ended up enforcing this on other people willingly, even when they weren't instructed to do so.
One aspect that I thought was interesting was that students were made to believe that they were chosen, that being a part of this on the ground level was like a high honor that could be, maybe a parallel to being a missionary or an evangelist, or it could be a parallel to getting roped into like an MLM. Either way, I thought that is sort of an interesting aspect as well.
That is really interesting because less than half of the students had been in Mr. Jones' class all along. The rest of the students that were present at the rally on the final day chose to skip their own classes to go to Mr. Jones' class and join the third wave, right?
Yeah.
So none of them were chosen. They were either assigned Mr. Jones' class to begin with, or they chose to join themselves. Mr. Jones never claimed that he handpicked the 30 students that would initially be part of his class at the beginning of the school year because they would end up being this prototype class for the third wave. These kids were randomly assigned the class to begin with, or they chose to join it. Nobody here is chosen. But a huge part of Mr. Jones' manipulation of these kids is telling them that they're chosen, they're representatives of a new thing. And this is very similar to how IFB people are told that they are chosen by God to be the last generation before the rapture, for example. Like, were you really chosen by God, or did you just happen to be born when you were born? I was keeping track of a few other things as you were telling your story. There were a couple other smaller things that jumped out to me as well that seemed really familiar.
What are those?
So the first thing is a quote from Mr. Jones talking about the very first day that he began this experiment. He said, we practiced this new attention position over and over. I walked up and down the aisles of seated students, pointing out small flaws, making improvements. Pointing out flaws in front of a group is a very common cult control tactic. Of course, someone correcting a flaw when other people happen to be there does not necessarily make a cult, but the way that he writes about it, I get the feeling that he was presenting these small improvements in a very cult-like way.
Sort of like if you were getting dress checked or dress coded
Yes.
in Howard Anderson. Yeah.
Mm-hmm. So I want to explain why I say cult-like way, because many of us know all too well that this can look like a scene from The Handmaid's Tale, where people are in a circle around an offender and publicly shaming that person until they break down. But I think that there's an equally common cult tactic that is much more effective on people who are just now joining an authoritarian group. I think Mr. Jones was walking up and down the aisles, pointing out little posture flaws, making small changes to the way that people were performing this attention position, and presenting it as this is for the benefit of everyone. It's this unique combination of shame, but it's for the greater good. I've talked about Jack Hyles using tactics like making offensive or personal jokes about a person in front of an audience, or praising somebody in front of an audience, or tearing someone down in front of an audience as a larger form of control. When Hyles did that, he wasn't just controlling the one person that he was praising or making fun of or tearing down. He was controlling everyone who was present and everyone who heard about it, because his power to humiliate you or raise you up was totally unchecked. So it wasn't really about a compliment or an insult or a joke at your expense. It was a demonstration of Jack Hyles' greater power to lift you up within the organization or to send you right back down to the bottom. It affects everybody who's in the room, not just the person who is being praised or who is being put down, because everyone in the room sees his power when Jack Hyles would do something like that, or when another authoritarian leader does something like that. So the practice of pointing out flaws can be used for control and manipulation in many different ways. I think what Mr. Jones may have been doing is, so he points out a flaw, the student feels embarrassment. He says, let's fix this because discipline is good for everyone. Now the student feels like they are helping, contributing to the greater good by submitting to the correction and fixing the flaw. That cocktail of embarrassment followed by feeling like a hero is incredibly potent, and it's very common in cults and cult-like scenarios.
That's a fantastic point, and I don't think that I would have noticed that, but it really takes somebody who's gone through this to really put that to words, doesn't it?
I hope that it's something you would have missed because it's something you haven't experienced. Because having been through that myself, as have many of our listeners, it is a pretty awful thing to experience.
The thing that I was thinking about with that, as far as like so you never played sports growing up?
No, I had PE in school.
No, IFB isn't really big on women's sports. Like, I remember playing on sports teams, and sometimes you'd have a coach who was a bit more of like in the style of like being an authoritarian or a disciplinarian or something like that. Or you'll have like a lot of times, like you'll have like I guess I never played football, but I have friends who, grew up playing football and they were on like the high school football teams or whatever. And a lot of the guys that were the like football coaches were like ex-military guys, or like they played football in high school and then they went into the military, and then after they got out of the military they were like a high school football coach, and that was the way that those two sorts of things kind of, but like that sort of style of we're getting everybody on the same page. So we're going to correct this behavior in one person. Then everybody's going to feel like they're the same and they're part of the team and working towards a common goal. And that's a mentality that can work really well if you're trying to build group unity with, I guess, a military unit, or if you're trying to build group unity within like a sports team.
I'm so glad you brought that up, because that's a great example of how this little psychological trick can be used in a way that is not necessarily cult-like or toxic. I think, number one, if you've agreed to join a football team, or if you have agreed to join the military, maybe there's an element of consent there. I think most people, like my little brother played high school sports, and I think there's a reasonable understanding that if you're on a football team, your coach is going to yell at you and psychologically attempt to motivate you to win games. If you've ever seen an episode of King of the Hill where Bobby's on a sports team, I think you would know that.
I'm just remembering the episode of King of the Hill where Bobby's a rodeo clown.
Oh, that's a good one.
No, but like that's very real. Like if you play sports, you're going to have a coach who's like, it's not just about like, okay, how do I break these people down? It's also about like, how do I get in this individual person's head and find out the right way to motivate them? And that's what makes somebody a good coach, is being able to motivate a lot of different kinds of people in a lot of different ways.
Yeah, so that's an example of the same psychological trick, like correcting somebody publicly in front of a group and then making them feel good about having been corrected, because they do feel the shame of having been corrected, but they also feel like they've contributed to the group by fixing whatever you were correcting. That's an example of how that can be used in a at least less toxic way, maybe even a non-toxic way in some cases. So there's another thing that I noticed about Mr. Jones' write-up of his experiment that is also kind of cult-like, in my opinion. So the quote is, "I also questioned if they could make a good showing because the press had been invited to record the event." So this is also a manipulation tactic. You train somebody to do something and then question whether they can do it. That's almost loosely related to negging, I think. It manipulates the person to want to try as hard as they can to successfully do the thing. For fellow parents of toddlers or young kids, we might use a hopefully much less toxic version of this on our children. Like, do you know how to put your socks on all by yourself? Can you show me? Like that. Or with a kindergartner, we might playfully say, "I bet you can't get all of those Legos back in the box in 2 minutes. Should we set a timer and find out if you can do it?"
I was going to say, this is like very carrot and stick, though, that you like give out punishments for the embarrassment and for imperfections, and then like you give validation and approval for good behavior.
Yeah, and I don't think it's problematic to do the thing like I was talking about. Can you put your socks on all by yourself? I want to see if you can do it. I literally do that all day because I have a kid who is in the "no, I do it" phase. I do think it would be problematic to say something like, "I don't think you're going to be able to behave yourself at grandma's house today."
Yeah, I would just be like, I'll prove you right. You know?
Right. Or even like, "I don't think you can tie your own shoes." Like you can use that same tactic that works gangbusters on most kids in a positive way without telling your kid that you don't believe in them. Because saying, "I don't think you can tie your own shoes" is negative and expresses that you don't believe in your kid. And you can get the exact same result if your kid is the type to be motivated by that. You get the exact same result by saying, "Can you show me how you tie your shoes?" Or, "Do you know how to tie your shoes by yourself?" Or, "I forgot how to tie my shoes. Can you show me?" Like, you get that same exact result without the negative connotation.
If you said that to me, I would have been like, are you stupid. I've been tying my shoes for like 8 months now.
You
What are
wouldn't have it like 3 years old. Like
Yeah,
these are tactics that work for very little, like 2, 3, and 4-year-olds.
I mean, like if you'd have said that to me, I would have. Honestly, I do remember feeling like this adult thinks I'm an idiot. Is honest. Like when people are just like, "Can you do this all by yourself?" I've been like, "What do you think I'm an idiot?" Or like I would have felt like so patronized.
That you should be a case study because most kids, I don't know what's going on in your brain because most kids by a certain age, like in my experience, sometime between 3 and 4. Like if I said that to Chuck now, she would really believe that I forgot how to do the thing that she was trying to show me how to do, and she would relish showing me how to do it. But most kids, sometime between 3 and 4, will pick up on the fact that you're faking, but they find it funny, so they will still do the thing to show you how to do it. Because most kids will get the very basic building blocks of like sarcasm and pretending by that age and will still really enjoy stepping into that teacher role to teach you, the adult, how to do the thing.
Yeah, I don't know. For me, like I was almost like a mini adult was how I was expected to be by my parents. So when I was like a little kid, so I don't know.
That's just not like what my experience has been with most kids. Anyway, telling someone explicitly that you don't believe in them or you don't think they can do something is absolutely a manipulation tactic. So you might see this in fall or spring programs in the IFB. So plenty of pastors are very positive. They're hyping the people up. I know we can make this goal. I know that God's going to bless us by having 350 people in our Sunday morning service on this date. However, sidebar, this can also be a manipulation tactic because people think they're going to disappoint the pastor that they admire if they don't reach the goal. But you might see pastors using the negative side of this tactic, pastors who complain about the program attendance or complain about offering numbers or say they don't think the congregation is going to reach their goal.
Interesting.
I've seen this used many times in cult environments of, I do not think you can do it.
In this similar vein, please recommend to me one friend or family member who you think would be interested in joining our movement. And give me their name and their address and their contact information was interesting to me because in his account he details how to like how they would initiate new members in that they would have to be nominated by a pre-existing member and then he would have to confirm them by giving them like a membership card. And that feels very much like, oh, I've been chosen, or, oh, I'm special because I'm right for this. Almost like an MLM sort of way.
That is definitely interesting. And it's wild to me that all of this happened in 5 days.
In 5 days. Well, I mean, have you been, I mean, I guess you didn't like have teachers the same way that I had teachers, but there was some times when, you know, like when you were in high school, you know that there was one teacher where you could just f- around in class if you wanted to and nothing would happen. And there were some teachers where you knew that you're not supposed to cross them. Like I had an English teacher who was an ex-Marine. And if there was a couple of times when I just said some wild in class, like I don't know, I think I just wanted attention. And I said something like, if Shakespeare is so great, how come he's dead? And he's like, I don't know. I was like 14, 15, something like that. And I was trying to be edgy. And he was just like, step out of my class, take 5, go stand in the hallway for 5 minutes or something like that. And I did kind of get called out for that. And then he came out and talked to me. He's like, if you're not going to take this class seriously, I don't know what you're going to do. Then he had me go back in and I just kind of had to chill there and take it easy the rest of the class period. And he didn't call on me the rest of the class period because he was afraid that I was going to say some bull. Which, to be fair, I probably would have said some disruptive, but like, you know, like how some kids respond to discipline And if you really do like make them take it seriously or like have actual real punishment, but for everybody, then that can have a distinct and profound effect on some people.
Yeah. Hearing about how you responded to discipline as a kid is terrifying as a person who is raising a child.
Yeah. I mean, I think that I probably freaked out my parents and freaked out my teachers quite a bit. The other aspect of this that I was thinking about was how a teacher is somebody who is automatically in a position of authority over somebody else. So if you're listening to this and you're thinking, I wonder if I could replicate that, it is maybe this was sort of emboldened by the fact that he knew that he would have a captive audience every day. But that also doesn't fully explain how quickly it got out of hand and how this became like a major thing over just the course of a week. Do you want to take up the offering and then we can come back and talk about the bite model real quick?
Okay, let's do it.
Yeah.
Hey, Sadie here. If this is your first time listening to the Leaving Eden podcast, make sure you go back and check out episode 57. It's a primer episode for new listeners. That episode tells my personal story and gives you all the terms and information that you'll need to know going forward. Also, check out our cult true crime series, The First Family of Fundamentalism, so that you can get the whole cult story. If you like our show, you can support us by joining our Patreon, where we have extended and uncensored episodes as well as other bonus content available. You can also join in the discussion in our Facebook group. That group is called Eden Exodus. Tell a friend, tell a family member, tell your worst enemy. The Leaving Eden podcast is a fully independent podcast, and we really appreciate your support. Now, back to the show.
We are back from our break. So we've just talked about like a short, maybe like academic-ish case study on the rise of and the cult tactics that an authoritarian leader can use on regular people. In order to get them under their control. In this section, what I'm going to do is I'm going to go through the bite model and discuss how the aspects of coercive control and authoritarian control actually function in real life and have functioned in real governments. As a refresher for our listeners, we talk about cult control using the bite model, and this is a model that was a system that was developed by cult expert Dr. Stephen Hassan. BITE stands for behavior control, information control, thought control, and emotion control, and these are the 4 ways in which cults control their members. And cult status is determined by the degree to which these 4 forms of coercive control are being used.
So we can talk about how these 4 types of coercive control might show up related to dictators.
Excellent. So behavior control, I think, is probably the easiest to identify because a state, an authoritarian regime especially, has the ability to almost on a whim create laws and dictate punishments for the violations of those laws. So the enforcement of said rules, of behavior rules, suddenly becomes, the stakes of that are raised quite a bit. So an authoritarian regime can enforce behavior control on the populace by restricting their freedoms. This is, and they have the power of the state to do this, as opposed to like a religious group or like a cult could do that, but they would not have the apparatus of law enforcement to help them accomplish that goal.
Well, some cults would. Like Jonestown had police.
That's true. That's very true.
I'm trying to remember what they were called. It may have been Red Guard or something. Cults that this is where we really get into the difference between cults that live communally and cults that don't. When we look at cults that live communally, and we've looked into several of those on the show, we did Jonestown, we talked about Waco, we talked about the Warren Jeffs FLDS, or even something like Heaven's Gate, which we have not yet covered. I would love to, but they lived communally. That in those communal cults, the enforcement of behavior control looks very different than what I experienced in the IFB, or what other people experience in other cults and high control groups that did not mandate communal living. The principles are the same, but the enforcement just looks very different.
An authoritarian regime may pass laws that would restrict free movement or free assembly. They may pass laws restricting where a person is or isn't allowed to live based on their ethnicity, based on their religion, based on their familial connections. A good example of this in American history, I think, would be the southern United States under Jim Crow, where Black people were restricted to living in certain areas. Also, redlining that occurred in many northern cities as well that didn't necessarily have Jim Crow laws, but there were also sundown towns where Black people were allowed to work but not stay after the sun was down, and Black people were subjected to horrible violence if they did not comply, or also if they did comply, and the apparatus of law enforcement was, in fact, behind and backing and enforcing these laws. This is as opposed to, like you may have experienced in fundamentalism, where if you wanted to buy a house, like you'd have to go to the pastor, and the pastor would have to say, yes, you can live in this area, or
yes, or no, you can't buy that house because then you're not going to be able to give as much money to the church, or that house is too far away from the church, and I think you will stop coming if you live that far away, so no, you're not allowed to do that.
If they're a religious government, they may pass laws that are based on religious doctrine. They may pass laws that are banning or requiring certain articles of clothing. I think a good example of this that was recent was the Iranian government, which has strict laws that are enforcing a dress code upon women. In 2022, a 22-year-old woman named Mahsa Amini was killed by the Iranian morality police for the crime of not covering her hair properly. This could also take the form of banning dress that is not gender conforming, and thereby trying to ban queer or trans people from existing publicly or expressing themselves publicly in accordance with their actual gender.
And that is so analogous to IFB clothing rules. I think when we're talking about behavior control, it is the same concept, just vastly different enforcement. Of course, banning queer and trans people from existing publicly looks like it's going to happen in Texas and Tennessee.
I mean, as long as we have to keep fighting that, but yeah, I mean, keep fighting that. We don't want us to turn into like the Christian version of like what they do have in countries like Iran, where the dress code for women is very strictly enforced, and it is enforced with the apparatus of law enforcement. They may pass laws that restrict when, how, and with whom you're allowed to have sex. And this could take the form of either banning non-cisgendered heterosexual relationships. This could also take the form of banning premarital sex. And there may be actual legal punishments in place for people who violate these laws.
I mean, just like in the IFB world or in a lot of evangelical world, you can get sent to conversion therapy. Yeah,
I mean, and that's basically a prison camp with forced labor and everything. The state has legal authority to imprison, kill, or forcibly relocate people. They may use imprisonment to force or coerce somebody into labor, like agape boarding school. But this tactic though was used prolifically by the Soviet Union under Stalin, with 18 million people being forced into the Gulag system. I mean, there are numerous cases of people being forcibly relocated and then forced into labor by authoritarian regimes. They may also restrict people's diet by manipulating the supply of food, or by saying some foods are good, some foods are bad. I think an example of this is that Maoist China restructured the country's farming economy, which contributed to a famine that killed tens of millions of people. They also create an environment of food scarcity and reward loyalists with food, and dissenters will not be rewarded with food. And so it creates an environment where you basically have to go along to get along.
Yeah, manipulating the availability of food is something that shows up in surprisingly a large percentage of cults. There are even pieces of that in the IFB in a couple of different places.
Well, they may manipulate your ability to generate income for your family.
Yeah, by insisting that you work for the church for a very small amount of money, or telling you can't take a better job because that job requires you to work on Wednesday nights and you wouldn't be able to come to Wednesday night church.
Or if you were, say, an IFB pastor who was not necessarily in the good graces of somebody like Jack Hyles, then he could, if he wanted to, kind of just send you off to the middle of nowhere to say you're starting a church plant in the middle of nowhere. And good luck, surviving on that, and totally screw you over.
Mm-hmm. Right. Like knowing that you're very unlikely to be able to generate the income that your family needs.
I mean, and, he could either support you by giving gifts to your church and giving gifts to your family, or he could withhold that as well. Mm-hmm. Based on, are you sending students to his cult college? Are you sending students to Hyles Anderson? Additionally, authoritarian regimes also tend to be highly patriarchal. Patriarchal is the word, especially ones that are religiously conservative. So women may have their reproductive rights restricted. The legal system may turn a blind eye to sexual violence against women, except where it is politically expedient and to the advantage of the regime. Like, for example, they may make up charges of sexual violence as a way to discredit dissenters or discredit critics or political rivals. They may also threaten to harm families. I want a good example of this, I think, is North Korea, in which 3 generations of families can be punished for one person's crime. So you could be punished for a crime that your grandfather committed.
Yeah, I see that a lot in the IFB, because if children, quote unquote, rebel, that can have huge social consequences for their parents, or even something a little beyond social consequences. If your parent is a pastor and you are a rebellious child, they could be removed from their position. Even if your parent is a Sunday school teacher or a choir member at a local IFB church, they could lose that position that might be really important to them based on your behavior as their child.
And it can go the other way too. Like, say you're a kid in fundamentalism and one of your parents has an extramarital affair, then you're suddenly, no one's going to want to marry you. No one's going to want to, be involved with your family.
Right. It's going to affect who you can date, who you can marry if you're in Bible college, and also who is allowed to be your friend if you're a little younger than that.
It's also worth mentioning that while a country may have enshrined in law certain civil liberties, these liberties may not be applied consistently, and this will give the government leaders or propagandists the ability to proclaim that certain freedoms are available to their citizens without actually having to guarantee those freedoms. And this brings me to talking about information control.
Let's do information control.
So I think information control is one of the biggest and most obvious crossovers between cults and authoritarian regimes. And I want to start this by reading a quote that has been attributed to Joseph Goebbels, who is the Minister of Propaganda for Nazi Germany. But I don't know if it's confirmed that that it was him that said it. I keep reading conflicting reports. Some people say that it was him. Some people say it's falsely attributed to him. But this quote, I think, is very telling. And I'm going to read that now. It's, "If you tell a lie big enough and keep repeating it, people will eventually come to believe it. The lie can be maintained only for such time as the state can shield the people from the political, economic, and or military consequences of the lie. It thus becomes vitally important for the state to use all of its powers to repress dissent. For the truth is the mortal enemy of the lie, and thus, by extension, the truth is the greatest enemy of the state. So, a authoritarian regime may use a big lie to allege a vast foreign conspiracy against their state, just in the same way that a cult like a Christian fundamentalism may allege a satanic attack on their church, something of that nature. And so for information control, I think the most obvious example of this is the use of pro-regime propaganda. Nazi propaganda posters were notorious for their glorification of Germans and Aryans and their dehumanization of races that they saw as inferior, such as Jews, Black people, Slavs, Romani. Up to and through the 1920s and into the 1930s, eugenics, or a belief in the purification of the human genome through controlling who should and shouldn't reproduce, was a popular pseudoscientific theory. Professors at universities and other institutions of higher education tended to be very white, very elitist, and also pretty racist and anti-Semitic as well. So it helped to sort of spread this theory. As a result, it was deemed a socially acceptable belief by the academic class, and the criticism of Nazism and Nazi propaganda among people whose voices mattered was not as vocal as it could have been.
So, pro-regime propaganda. Everything Jack Hyles ever said. But seriously, I'm thinking about how many different things. I was talking to someone who grew up at First Baptist Church of Hammond recently, and they reminded me how often they were told, you go to the greatest church in the world, you are part of the greatest church in the world, you're the best, you have to be the best, and had that reinforced to them. But those who weren't members of First Baptist Church of Hammond had the same message reinforced. They are the best. We are all following them. Jack Hyles is the greatest pastor in the world. Jack Scopp is the leader of all fundamentalism. It was reinforced through all of the books from Hyles publications, from letters from other pastors. Even the sermon Duty could be seen as pro-regime propaganda, don't you think?
Oh, absolutely.
Here is evidence that if you don't follow me, something bad will happen to you. Therefore, I am special and chosen by God.
The idea of the greatest X in the world, that's inherently subjective. But in this situation, there's like a right answer, So like the Nazis would say, well, the Aryans, we're the greatest race in the world. We're the greatest civilization that the world has ever known. And we need to share our greatness with the rest of the world. Whereas like if I was like, hey, Sadie, what do you think is the greatest band in the world? That'd be an opinion, right? Yeah.
Yeah.
And we would have differing opinions on that. But like the greatest, that's inherently subjective, but there is a right answer to this question. And it creates in a situation where there is, okay, this is the correct answer to this question as what is the best, what is the greatest, that can be, if it is something that is like a pro-regime, a political point, a political ideology, or a political motivation, then that can be extremely harmful, and that can be a way to instill thought-stopping cliches into people. I want to go on and talk about control of media. The Soviet Union, for example, was well known for tightly controlling news media. Journalists who were critical of the government were punished. Meanwhile, the Soviet Communist Party had its own state-sanctioned news outlet called Pravda, or Truth. A state-run news outlet essentially ensures that in any event, there is always a regime-friendly version of events. As we talked about on this show, figuring out fact versus fiction is difficult, and constantly questioning every piece of information that you hear is mentally exhausting. While people do not always accept what state media says is true, they will eventually accept that enough of it is true that the propaganda sort of becomes part of a fabric of their lives. For example, the thing that I'm thinking about here with the fundamentalism connection is the letter of how many untruths? Was it 13 untruths? 15 untruths?
I don't remember.
This is an untruth.
Closer to 20.
It was the sword of the Lord, the biblical evangelist, all of these, and like J. Frank Norris's consolidation of the Texas Baptist.
Right. When J. Frank Norris won the Texas Baptist newspaper war and made all the Baptists quit literally shooting at each other on trains because he bought all the Texas Baptist newspapers that existed.
Yeah, and he was able to consolidate them and then use them to his advantage by citing articles that he used himself as the source in to say, see, the newspaper says it's true, so it's true.
Right, and then reworking and revamping those newspapers into more and more blatant versions of a newspaper that was just purely complimentary to him and supported him no matter what.
So some examples of state-controlled media are Volkischer Beobachter, which was the Nazi propaganda minister Joseph Goebbels' newspaper, which was run from 1925 to 1945. Il Popolo d'Italia was Benito Mussolini's fascist newspaper, which was founded in 1914 and operated until the fall of fascist Italy in 1943. Pravda was run by the Russian Communist Party. It began in 1911 and was state-sanctioned media throughout the life of the Soviet Union. And fun fact, it's still around today, being run by the Communist Party of the Russian Federation. Now that the Soviet Union is no more, and now that it doesn't have the backing from the government itself, and Russia isn't communist anymore, but it is nowhere near as popular as it once was. However, Russia still has state-sanctioned media in the form of Russia Today. Iran has Press TV. China has Xinhua. North Korea has Rodong Sinmun. I want to also make a distinction between state-run media and publicly supported media. So state-run media would be something that's basically like, this is what the regime says and this is fact, whereas publicly supported media would be media that is financially supported by the government but is independent, but has independent editorial, but is editorially independent of the state. So it would be the difference between a publication like Russia Today and a publication like the BBC or NPR or PBS. I think I want to talk about, I'm trying to find think of like an IFB or at least a Christian version of this. Because there's going to be like the J. Frank Norris having his official state media publication, but then there's going to be
right, or Christian Womanhood, which is an FBCH, or was at the time that I was growing up and reading Christian Womanhood as a physical magazine. It was an FBCH owned and produced publication.
But then there's also magazines like Christianity Today that we've or Cornerstone magazine that we've used as a source for episodes that we've done. And while we don't necessarily agree with maybe the aims of the magazine as a whole, we found that under certain circumstances, their journalistic integrity is very good.
Yeah, I always like to joke, if Christianity Today wrote something about theology, I probably hate it, But if they wrote something about anything other than theology, it's probably a great article.
Yeah, I mean, what did we use there? Unlike Mike Warnke and
the Mike Warnke expose, the John Todd expose, they also contributed to our source list for the Microphone into Hell episode, all sorts of things. I'm trying to think where a publication like Sword of the Lord or Biblical Evangelist falls on this spectrum, because I don't think you would call it fully state-run media or publicly supported media. It's kind of in between. Sword of the Lord, for example, is or was. I'm talking about it as it existed 15 to 20 years ago when I was reading it as a tiny child and probably shouldn't have been, because I know there have been administrative changes to Sword of the Lord since then. But in its heyday, it was operated out of a local church, but the editorial staff was pulled from multiple churches around the country. Whoever was the editor-in-chief did have immense power in fundamentalism, but it is not owned by the IFB, because the IFB is a movement and not a denomination and does not own anything.
But there's also like a board of people who run Sword of the Lord, and Jack Hyles, what his allegation was that because he held up or objected to somebody being put in charge of Sword of the Lord, that was reason for them to run a hit piece on him, alleging his infidelity.
In the Biblical Evangelist. Right.
In the Biblical Evangelist, yeah.
So that was just an interesting thought experiment, because it's really neither state-run media nor publicly supported media. It's kind of somewhere in the middle of those. But the power dynamics around Sword of the Lord, especially 20 and 30 years ago, are really interesting.
Yeah, I mean, it kind of reminds me of in countries like the United States, where we have a free press and we have independently run newspapers that are allowed to criticize the government as much as they want, oftentimes a demagoguerous leader will form a sort of alliance with an independent news outlet, essentially turning this outlet into a propaganda arm of their government. And I think the most obvious example of this is the way that Fox News functioned as the media arm of the Trump administration. Now that the internet has made journalism, both good and bad journalism, more accessible to more people, authoritarian regimes are often able to weaponize a foreign free press to their advantage through access journalism. So access journalism is the practice of prioritizing access to a source or a subject over accurate or ethical reporting about said source or subject. So by only allowing in foreign press on the condition that they report in a regime-friendly manner, authoritarian regimes can, to some extent, control what people in the outside world know about what is going on in their country. So, if I were an authoritarian regime, I would allow in, journalists from AP or Reuters or Washington Post, but then make it clear to them that their safety may be in danger if they write about certain things, or if they write certain opinions or expose certain things in the government. Then the news outlet that they write for then may make the decision that they may say, okay, well, that is a deal breaker for us, and we're just not going to report on what's going on in your country, and we're going to rely on other ways to get the information out. Or they may decide that having access to the source is more important than reporting 100% accurately or reporting everything that they want to write. Then the story gets published in countries like the United States or that do have a free press. And this can have an effect on the way that voters in these countries perceive a foreign authoritarian government and what foreign policy priorities they will support regarding said regime.
You said that authoritarian regimes are able to control what people know, control what outsiders know about what goes on the inside.
Yes.
And IFB churches do this a lot through social media. There will be rules or there will be sermons about what you can and can't post on social media to not let, there's a huge culture of don't let outsiders know what's going on the inside, even in families. And a lot of our IBLP survivor friends have talked about family cults, or Bill Gothard made every family into a cult and every father into a cult leader. Even in family cults, you see this a lot of don't tell people that we use physical punishment. Don't tell people what goes on in our family. And it goes out to the church as well. And First Baptist Church of Hammond is absolutely notorious for this, one of the worst offenders. But there is very much a culture of don't let people from the outside know what goes on here. And it's really making me start to wonder, are these dictatorships functioning like cults, or are these cults functioning like dictatorships? It's turning into kind of a circular thing in my head.
Well, the thing that jumps out to me is I remember that recording that you made of, was it Eddie Lapina?
Yes, the recording I made in the gym at Hiles Anderson.
After Scop turned himself into the police. And he said, if there are any journalists poking around asking you what's going on, just don't say anything. Just say we're praying for whatever. And
we were coached on what to say.
And not letting outsiders know what's actually going on in the country is a function of authoritarian regimes. They can also employ social media trolls, bots, to essentially flood the airwaves with propaganda and make people in other countries not know what is or isn't true, because it's easier to tell a lie than it is to debunk a lie. So you can simply overwhelm people with a vast quantity of misinformation. And since social media apps like Twitter or TikTok or Instagram will prioritize engagement over accuracy, a single viral post can shift a narrative within minutes, as long as it plays into audience ignorance or audience prejudice. So a prejudiced audience won't care whether or not the information that they are spreading is a factual truth, as long as it feels like an emotional truth. And I think the most prolific example of this has been the way that Russia and Vladimir Putin have used social media trolls to their advantage. They used social media trolls to promote the Brexit referendum and to promote Donald Trump's 2016 and 2020 presidential campaigns, and to attempt to put a drain on American support for the war in Ukraine following Russia's invasion in 2022.
It's funny because the IFB does not use bots because they're scared of technology, but they almost train their people to be bots. I've seen it so many times. A church will put out a video, a propaganda similar video, to say it charitably, and they will instruct all of their people, go like this video on Facebook, go comment and say something positive. And they will send their people out to comment on different things on social media. If you see someone talking negatively about our church, make sure you say, there was a post that went around right after Let Us Pray went out, where a First Baptist Hammond member posted about how they have had a good experience with the church and encouraged others to do the same. It's funny to see almost that bot-like activity, but with real humans.
Yeah, it's almost like, I'm trying to think of another example of this, like when there will be like assault allegations come out against somebody, and then there will be somebody else coming out and saying, I've never had a bad experience with this person. This person is fine. Who was it? Was it Iggy Azalea that did that?
I don't remember.
Who did she? Oh, Iggy Azalea defended Tory Lanez, who shot Megan Thee Stallion. That's what it was.
Oh.
Yeah. That is so true though, because I feel like every time I go to like YouTube and we look at like a pastor video of some sermon. The video will have like 300 views, but there will be like 180 comments saying, "This is a great sermon, God bless," or "God is smiling upon this church and this ministry," or "This ministry, so many great messages," or just something like that. And with the praying hands emoji, like the cross emoji, like there will be like a disproportionate amount of comments and likes to the amount of views on the video. I should also note that it is easier to practice information control if there is a language barrier between your people and a free press. Although now that AI and like artificial intelligence translation tools are getting much better, the wall may come down in the near future. However, there's also a potential for generative AI to create fake images and fake video and misinformation. And I don't know what's going to happen with that in the future. And that's only sort of started to begin to be realized. But one of the main processes, the one purposes of propaganda is to make people question what they can and can't trust in order to force them to default which is the most convenient or self-serving message to believe, which tends to fall in line with what their own personal prejudices are. Another aspect of information control is the use of informants to report dissent to the government. And a famous example of this is the East German Stasi during the Cold War. And when German reunification began in 1989, the Stasi had more than 173,000 informants, or 1 in 63 East Germans, which is pretty wild.
Yeah, but that makes sense, thinking about how Mr. Jones' students volunteered to inform on others.
Oh, exactly. Yeah, or I mean, just like, what would happen to Hyles Anderson if you were a bit in trouble and you needed to save face a little bit, you could rat somebody out.
That's really interesting. I'm not sure if I have really thought about informants being information control before, because we talk all the time about how thought control and emotion control go hand in hand, and they create this cycle of self-brainwashing. But we talk about sometimes how information control and behavior control go hand in hand. But the thing I hadn't really thought about before is how informants is information control, and it is part of the enforcement of the behavior control.
Well, if you don't know who you can trust and you don't know who you can talk to, that's going to affect what information you're willing to share with other people.
Right.
And so that's one. I mean, I think that it could also be under behavior control because you don't know who's watching you do whatever.
It's kind of both, isn't it?
Yeah.
Because it's enforcement for the behavior control. It controls your behavior of who you will share information with. But it's information, so it's information control. And it is a way of preventing information from getting to other people. Because let's say I have information and you are not an informant, but I think you're an informant, you are not going to get the information that I have, and that might be information that you need.
It's just like how Rachel didn't let you in on her cup prank. She thought you were a good kid.
Rachel did not let me in on her cup prank because that was my freshman year and I was such a hacker. She was 100% right. I do not blame her.
Well, also the other thing, it could be under thought control because it could have you thinking bad thoughts lead to bad actions. And if I do bad actions, then somebody's going to be watching.
It's, the overlap of the 4 types of coercive control is so interesting to me.
Yeah. Why don't we go and take a break and then we'll come back and talk about thought control and emotion control. And then we'll wrap. Is that good?
Sounds great.
All right.
So I want to move on to talk about thought control. I guess the third aspect of the BITE model.
We find thought control and emotion control to be really important when we're determining how cult-like a group might be, because there are lots of different groups that institute behavior control that are not a cult. Your job surely institutes some kind of behavior control, from a dress code or a code of code of conduct, or you can't be on your phone in front of customers or whatever. And that does not make your job a cult. And there are groups that are not cults that institute information control, although that may be a little more rare. But what really, the secret sauce, in my opinion, that really makes a cult is effective and pervasive thought control and emotion control.
Yeah, and I mean, we all practice information control on ourselves because, I mean, just basic, I mean, you could flip it on its head and say, oh, well, practicing good media literacy, technically that's information control. And that, like, if you were doing it, if you were making a bad faith argument, and we all have to practice just by deciding, I want to watch this, I don't want to watch this, or I like this kind of movie, I don't like this kind of movie because of the themes in this kind of, like, that's it, that on a surface level, that's information control. But that doesn't make it cult control. I mean, thought control and emotion control are the ones that you really have to do to yourself and that somebody else can't really do to you.
Right. Somebody else can influence you to do it to yourself. And the thought control and emotion control that you enforce on yourself will make you more committed to the behavior control and the information control. And it kind of starts a cycle of becoming more and more invested in this group.
Yes. So on Dr. Hassan's Bite Model Resource Center, the first point under thought control is that a group will require members to internalize the group's doctrine as truth. There are 4 subpoints to this, which are adopting the group's map of reality as reality, instilling black and white thinking, deciding between good and evil, and organize people into us versus them. And I don't know if we've totally talked about map of reality yet. I know that I remember when you were talking about the Scientology arc triangle, like this must have been years ago, 2 years ago, 3 years ago, something like that. And how the shared reality, when you're trying to form a connection with somebody, sharing a reality with somebody is a very important piece of connecting with somebody. And in the thought control, basically part of what it's supposed to do is it's supposed to work with the information control to make you internalize whatever this group's version of reality is as the reality. When we talk about like a map of reality, what we're talking about is that there is a single lens through which all thoughts, all interactions, all incoming information are filtered. This is the core to the ideology of just about every single authoritarian leader that we can think of. You've experienced this, Sadie.
So when the IFB says the reality is that only a small percentage of people are saved, and those are the only people that are going to heaven, and it's your responsibility to reach everybody else who is currently going to hell and try to pull them over to Team Heaven, you have to accept that reality. Or when they say that men are animals who cannot control themselves and they're visually stimulated, so you have to cover your body and it's your responsibility to make sure men don't lust, you have to accept that reality.
Yeah. And so that would basically factor into every way that you know, if you're just walking around and and you just see a guy on the street, you might be thinking, oh no, that guy would want to do horrible things to me. I got to make sure I'm covered up. And it could just be some guy minding his own business and he doesn't even look at you.
Right. Or that guy is unsaved and he is going to go to a burning hell forever. And it's my responsibility to try to help him get saved.
Some examples of this that came from authoritarian leaders. One example, the core of Hitler's Nazi ideology is that every conflict in the world is actually a race war. That, Aryan people, white people at the top, and then, black people are at the bottom. And there's basically a hierarchy of races, and every conflict, every battle in the world is a battle is a battle for racial supremacy. And that is the core of Hitler's Nazi ideology. The core ideology of, say, religious extremists in like American Christian nationalists, or the or like say the clerics that run the Islamic Republic of Iran. The core of their ideology is that every conflict is a holy war. And we've talked about this on our episodes where we've talked about Christian nationalism, where they, what with the manifest destiny and the belief that America now is analogous to biblical Israel. The core of the ideology of leftist dictators like Stalin, Mao, Pol Pot was that every conflict in the world is a class war. The core ideology of a dictator like Vladimir Putin is that every conflict in the world is a fight against Western hegemonic power.
The ideology of the IFB, by the way, is that every conflict is a fight of good versus evil. And of course, the IFB is always on the side of good.
Dividing it into us versus them, good versus evil, black and
white.
Well,
the IFB is very literal.
I mean, very literally a cult. And so with one of these perspectives, basically the way that information control limits our perspectives, the aspect of thought control limits the avenues of intellectual curiosity by limiting the ways in which it is deemed acceptable to examine either social or interpersonal or geopolitical conflicts. So, like, say when you were in the IFB, if somebody was having a fight with somebody else, you wouldn't think of it as like, why is this person fighting with this other person? What are their grievances? You would look at, say, oh, this person's saved, this person's not saved, so this person who's saved must be right in their conflict that they must be having. But the other side of this is that it frames this way of looking at things as like whichever conflict is the way that you look through is the way that your lens is filtered through. It frames that as the only war worth fighting. It basically puts every single other conflict that's not this holy war or this class war or this race war as basically a distraction from the real fight that's going on. And this is a valuable tool for dictators or wannabe dictators, because not only does it filter the information in such a way that makes it easily digestible, it also gives people who buy in, followers who would buy in, a sense of purpose and a sense of identity that they may otherwise be lacking. And I think a good example of this that we talked about earlier was the young student in Mr. Jones' class that volunteered to be Mr. Jones' bodyguard. He was seen as he was a very average student. He was sort of a bit of a social outcast. Nobody really special, but he really found a sense of purpose with himself in this in this conflict, in this way to see himself as an insider versus the outsiders.
Yeah, I really liked what you said about giving somebody a sense of purpose.
Yeah, I mean, you had a sense of purpose when you were in the IFB.
Yeah, I will tell you, when you feel that what you are doing as a group is the most important thing in the world, that it makes members of the group feel very important.
I mean, yeah, and we see this all over and not just with because I guess we all want to feel like our fight is the most important fight, because maybe everybody has a little bit of main character syndrome. But the idea that you yourself as a person could be the great hero in a global conflict is almost kind of like an appealing thought. Well, one of the core principles of fascism is that people exist to serve the state. So a fascist or an authoritarian state may get its citizens to practice thought control on themselves by asking them to filter their thoughts through a lens of, is this thought patriotic or is this thought unpatriotic? And this is parallel topics that we've talked about in the past, like Christian fundamentalism. Be asked to think, does this thought serve God? Is this a holy thought, or is this thought unholy and not befitting of a does not serve God for me to think this?
Right. And even something that you genuinely think is correct or something that you genuinely feel, like an emotion you genuinely feel, can be bad. The verse that they will use for that is the heart is desperately wicked above all. The heart is deceitful above all things and desperately wicked. Who can know it? And they use that verse to say that even a real feeling or a real thought that you genuinely have that comes from yourself and not an outside source can be a bad thing.
Which is fair, which is true. I mean, I know that I've had thoughts come into my head, and then you think about that for a second and you think, oh, wait, that's not. If you take that thought to its logical conclusion, that means all sorts of horrible things.
Right, but there's no such there is such thing as an incorrect thought, but there's no such thing as a bad emotion. Even emotions that so there is such thing as giving into emotions that you shouldn't. If you feel the emotion of anger and it makes you want to hurt somebody else, you should not do that thing, but that doesn't mean that your anger is sinful or that you shouldn't feel it or that you should somehow prevent yourself from feeling angry.
Right. And that takes me on to, I guess that leads us into emotion control. So emotion control is like thought control is aspect of cult control that usually people kind of have to practice on themselves. And it's a very big part of, where the self-brainwashing comes in.
I feel like the emotion of patriotism can definitely fit here because it can refer to both actions and thoughts and emotions.
Yeah, I mean, what did we have? We had when Mr. Jones was giving his example, it was strength through discipline, strength through community, and strength through action. And so the emotion, like the feeling of patriotism, can be reflected in all of those things. So I'm glad that you brought that up because I think that's a good place to start. With emotion control, of course, some feelings are good and some feelings are righteous, but also some feelings are evil and some feelings are weak. So pride and patriotism and superiority, those are good feelings. And doubt and internal conflict are bad feelings. So like, if you're, say, doubting what is being asked of you, then that's a bad emotion to feel. And it's encouraged that you would power through that doubt and do the right thing. And if you came out later and said, I wasn't sure if I could do this, but I did it, then that's something that you would probably be praised for doing.
Yeah, within cults, people are often taught techniques to change the emotions that they're feeling. This can be thought terminating cliches, which also go back to both information control and thought control. They can even, I almost want to say, wire your brain, because a leader could tell you that when you think you feel afraid, you are actually feeling excitement to take on a task. And the leader might say that over and over and over again, enough that you would believe it. And whenever you felt the emotion of fear, you would interpret it as, I'm excited to do this thing.
That's very interesting because that takes me back to the Goebbels quote that we talked in for information control, is that if you have a big lie, you can repeat it enough and enough and enough that it becomes the truth, as long as people are insulated from the consequences of that lie being true. So while we normally, and I'm glad that you were talking about fear, because while we normally associate fear with weakness, fear can also be encouraged. Like fear of the outside world, fear of your enemies, fear of letting your family down, fear of letting your country down. Those are fears that are encouraged. But those are also fears that you should be able to overcome. And if you succumb to those fears, then that is something that is shameful. The government, say they may hold rallies to whip people up into a fervor in order to inspire anger or in order to inspire rage against a foreign enemy or a minority population or a political adversary. And this could possibly spiral into vandalism. It could spiral into petty violence, or it could spiral into a, say, politically advantageous planned riot like the one that occurred on the 6th of January in 2021 when supporters of President Donald Trump stormed the U.S. Capitol in an attempt to stop the certification of the presidential election. But, through Nazi Germany, there would often be rallies that were then followed by vicious attacks on the local either Jewish community or Romani community. And I'm thinking also, say, a Ku Klux Klan meeting that became a rally that then spiraled into a vicious attack on the local Black community. Things of that nature are also, I think, good examples of this phenomena. According to Umberto Eco's book, Fascism, in which he outlines the 14 core pillars of fascism, one of them is that your enemy is both strong and your enemy is weak. And this way, your enemy both poses a serious threat to you, but your movement could easily defeat them. Like, your commitment to the thing or the ideal of your country could easily defeat the enemies. So they're strong enough to invoke fear, but they're weak enough to invoke a determination and a willingness to make a personal sacrifice.
Okay, that is exactly how the IFB believes about the devil, though.
Yeah?
Because, Satan will be defeated and the gates of hell shall not prevail against us, but also the devil walks about like a roaring lion. He puts messages in every song and in games and in books and in movies.
And he's always out there. He's ever present.
Yeah. But demons have to submit to Jesus and Bob Larson can kick them out.
I mean, like, it's so interesting because it's like you can, and I'm thinking back to, all of the protocols of the Elders of Zion conspiracy, or, say the Illuminati conspiracies that were the Satanic Panic was based around. That this is an organization that is everywhere, that they control every aspect of your life. But if you join Jesus, then you can fight them. That's like the man.
Well, like the Jesuits were powerful enough to control Alberto Rivera's entire life and kidnap him and put him in an iron lung on heavy sedatives. But then they were dumb enough to just let him go. But then they were strong enough to have him followed all over the country. And people would attempt to get him in car wrecks, but they were too weak to actually kill him. Or like with John Todd, how the Satanists were powerful and everywhere and all in government and in law enforcement. And all the influential people in the world were Satanists and Illuminati. And they shot at John Todd like dozens of times, but they couldn't manage to hit him.
Yeah, or the Jews control the media, yet here we are on the media
Right.
talking about how evil the Jews are. It's just like, what are we doing here? Like, oh, and they'll silence this. They'll silence this for sure. Yeah, sure, Alex Jones. Like,
Right.
I mean, allow yourself to get tons and tons and tons and tons of money from the people that you're. I mean, convince people, you convince people that they're oppressed by a secret invisible force, and they'll, I guess, turn out their pockets. But I think one aspect of emotion control that we haven't really talked about as much, that I think is a huge part of these sort of these dictatorships, of these authoritarian regimes, the importance of like a leader or like a national symbol, somebody charismatic, somebody to glorify, somebody who you can love, but somebody also who you fear. So one example of these, obviously, the Nazis, during their reign, Germans weren't pressured to swear oaths of loyalty to Germany. They were pressured to swear oaths of loyalty to Hitler. And for all intents and purposes, Hitler and Germany were essentially one and the same, that it was basically just a giant crime syndicate that operated as a country. Following Joseph Stalin's speech to the Soviet Politburo in 1937, applause reigned for many minutes, 5, 6, 7 minutes, because everybody present was terrified to be the first person to stop clapping because they feared retribution. But also, there are still people today who look back on him and see him as an inspirational figure. In fact, Saddam Hussein modeled himself after Joseph Stalin, and that's why he had a mustache. Did you know that?
No, I did not know that.
One other example of this is Romanian dictator Nicolae Ceausescu was apparently so impressed with the praise and worship that North Koreans lauded onto dictator Kim Il-sung when he visited in 1971 that he decided to model the fanfare of his July theses after a North Korean military parade and make similar policy changes in order to basically try to make his country into to have a mini Maoist cultural revolution.
I feel like any of those last 3 stories could have been about Jack Hyles.
Yeah.
So you said Hitler and Germany were one and the same. Well, Hyles and First Baptist Church of Hammond were one and the same. Hyles had grand ovations and applause, and other pastors would visit him and see the way that he was treated by his people, and they would take inspiration from his authority and bring back practices to their churches. All of that is very Hyles.
The fact that, your dad gave me, I have this picture hanging above where we're recording this podcast right now in my bedroom. Your dad gave me this portrait of Jack Hyles. And that's such a weird, it is so weird to have a portrait of your pastor like that. And just to have that be an object that is given out, that is passed around.
But tons of people have photos of Jack Hyles. I wouldn't say everybody had one in their house. Many of the people I knew growing up had a picture, if not Jack Hyles, then some other famous fundy. They might have a picture of Lester Roloff, or they might have a picture of GB Vick or somebody else. But it was very common to have a picture of IFB leader of some kind in your house. It was not unusual to have a picture of Jack Hyles in your house. And it was almost universal to have pictures of people like Jack Hyles in your office if you were a pastor.
If you walked into somebody's house and they had, well, I guess if somebody was a history buff, they might have a picture, pictures of a bunch of presidents or something like that. But if you walked into somebody's house and they had a photo of Joe Biden hanging in there, that would be a weird thing.
That would definitely be odd if they were not related to this person.
No, I'm trying to think. I know people have pictures of Trump in their house because I know that's a thing, because he is legit
I'm sure that's got to be a thing.
Yeah, no, and I know people do that. I've seen people make AI images of Trump where he's a beefy dude and just.
The Trump and Jesus ones are the ones that I hate to love to hate.
Yeah, the thing is, I do feel like the worship of a leader itself, there has to be a line crossed where it goes from being oh, this is a person that I admire, to, oh, this is almost idolatrous, in that you would have this picture of this person up in the same way that you would have a picture of Jesus up. Picked a lot of examples that I did, I think, because a lot of the examples that I've picked for this are widely identifiable and very well documented, but there are hundreds of authoritarian leaders who have behaved exactly in the same sort of way. The other thing that I'm thinking about, now that I thought about the Saddam Hussein modeling himself after Stalin, Jack Hyles modeling himself after J. Frank Norris is kind of the thing that came to mind for me.
So for me, the point of all of this is not a dictatorship is also a cult. The point is that there are reliable, proven ways to manipulate and control a group of people. It's more of a universal truth kind of point that I get out of this episode. There are certain ways to manipulate a group that work almost every time if the environment is right. When people are stressed and have needs, and a charismatic leader rises up and offers to give them what they need, people are going to get manipulated and controlled unless something happens to interrupt that natural process. I love the comparisons you've made here between how people come to support dictators or support fascist governments and how people come to support cult leaders or be part of a cult. I could say it 1,000 times and I would still not say it enough. A person being a cult member doesn't mean that they're stupid or bad. It means that they're human and they were put in the right scenario to be manipulated without the tools to combat that manipulation.
Also, I think everybody knows how it feels to be in a setting where your political views are deeply unpopular. And everybody, like, especially listeners to this show, where maybe you're, deconstructing a little bit and maybe you who, like, and I know for a fact that a lot of our listeners have been that person who is got blamed for ruining Thanksgiving for their political beliefs. I mean, a lot of our listeners have had that, like, and everybody knows that, like, feeling a social pressure to change your political beliefs, and like that can weigh heavily on a person. And it's much easier to just kind of like go along with everyone else rather than like not partake, like rather than like just not dive into the jingoism. Like that can be difficult if everyone's doing it around you and you're like, that kind of looks like fun. I really want to feel like I'm a part of something. But it can almost be like a cheap thrill. I don't know. Like politically, I think we've all been in the place where thought stopping cliches, or where you're trying to talk to somebody about policy, about like, this is a change that I would like to see happen in this country. And then they'll drop a thought stopping cliche and completely shut down that conversation. And it's so easy to like throw out a logical fallacy that sounds really good. And it takes so much time and effort to like debunk the logical fallacy that I think like, and like how Tom Brady said that if you're explaining, you're losing. And I think that's emblematic.
So my final thoughts on this go back to Ron Jones' experiment. I want to read something that he said.
Go for it.
If our enactment of the fascist mentality is complete, not one of you will ever admit to being at this final third wave rally. Like the Germans, you will have trouble admitting to yourself that you came this far. You will not allow your friends and parents to know that you were willing to give up individual freedom and power for the dictates of order and unseen leaders. You can't admit to being manipulated, being a follower, to accepting the third wave as a way of life. You won't admit to participating in this madness. You will keep this day and this rally a secret. It's a secret I shall share with you.
That was one of my favorite quotes from the whole story.
So you know what this quote really made me think of? It made me think of some of the common reactions that people have to a life after fundamentalism. I wonder if there was even one of the students who walked away from that final rally thinking, well, the third wave movement was a fraud, but Mr. Jones really had it right with the ideals of discipline, community, and action. And okay, maybe people shouldn't be forced to sit in the attention position at school, but I'm going to keep doing it, and I'm going to recommend it to other people because I think it's really the best way to sit for maximum learning. I wonder if there was one of those approximately 80 kids who really bought into it. If there was a kid who grew up and was still sitting at their desk like that as a 50-year-old at an office job. And maybe there wasn't. There's only 80 kids. But what if Mr. Jones' experiment had included 800 kids instead of 80? If he had indoctrinated 800 teenagers before revealing that it was all a sham, don't you think that in a group of 800, at least 10 or 20 of them might have banded together and kept up the attention posture and kept up the chants and the hand signs? What if it had 20 kids out of 800? Yeah, I would think so.
You know what I think might have happened?
Huh?
Is I think that when he revealed to them, no, this was all a social experiment and you were all duped, I think that some of them would have been like, actually, it wasn't a social experiment. We weren't all duped. The third wave is real. And Mr. Jones just got like leaned on by the government or the Illuminati or whoever was trying to keep him down to try to keep our movement down. And that's why it would have like ended up as like a conspiracy thing.
Right. And now Mr. Jones is bad and weak, but we are the strong ones who are carrying on the ideals of the third wave. Or
even,
the conspiracy theory that I saw coming was, well, the presidential candidate really was going to speak about the third wave and announce this whole program. But Mr. Jones was an operative and he was told, if you turn on the TV and the presidential candidate doesn't come on the TV, then it's over. Like something has gone wrong with the higher ups, and tell them it's all a lie. So this made me think though of like people who see the corruption in the IFB, but then end up joining something like the NIFB. Because some people, even when they're presented with clear evidence that the movement that they were a part of was a sham, are not able to entirely give it up. There are people who are just not able to admit that they are wrong, so they make up a way that they were right all along, and this often expresses itself as a conspiracy theory.
That's such a... Man, I didn't even... That's like, that's like Q stuff. Where how like every few months it's like, oh, a new Q thing is going to happen, and then it doesn't happen. And they're like, actually, this is what's really going to happen. Like, it's all part of the plan. Like, moving the
goalposts.
You move the goalposts.
And that's hypothetical. But that certain students might have come up with this conspiracy theory, or if there had been more students, a larger sample size, that maybe these conspiratorial groups would have formed within the group of 800. But Mr. Jones was demonstrating in the bit of the speech that I read to you, the most common outcome of something like this. He said, you will deny that you attended this rally. You won't tell your parents about this. You will deny that you so easily became a follower and that you were manipulated. And you will absolutely deny that you ever bought into this. And I will keep this secret with you. We see this in ex-fundamentalist and ex-cult spaces all the time. People claiming that they never fully bought into it. And to be clear, I'm not doubting those people. I'm not saying that they're lying to save face. That is not at all where I'm coming from. One of the things that really bugs me as a cult survivor is that people don't seem to understand when I say I was 100% bought in and I also had doubts at the same time. People seem to think that only one of those things can be true. And people also seem to think that if you were ever 100% bought in, then you are stupid, even if you were born into the group, which is really unfair and takes me off. Like I have literally, sorry, this is a rant. This can go on Patreon. I have literally had people to my face say, how could you be so stupid to fall for that? When I was born into it.
I think that people where that reaction likely would come from would be somebody who had an upbringing like mine.
Yeah.
Where, I mean, I was definitely raised with the feeling like you're too smart to ever fall for something like this.
Mm-hmm.
Like if I had met you when I was like 15, or 14 or 13 or 12 or whatever, and I had met you, and I probably would have said, how can you be so dumb to believe that?
Mm-hmm.
Like that. I mean, I was pretty, as we've covered on Patreon, this episode, I was pretty irreverent as a child, and did not have the best social skills also. I probably could have said something like that, but that wouldn't have come from a sense of me wanting to actually have a conversation and actually like try to dissect what it is you believe. It would have come from my own sense of superiority, of my own sense of feeling like I am too smart to fall for something like this. I could never be taken in like that. And I'm telling you right now, and this is something that I've like, one of my biggest takeaways from doing this show with you is that if you feel like you're too smart to ever get taken in like by something like this, then you are absolutely the perfect mark for something like this.
Mm-hmm.
Like as soon as you like feel like you're invulnerable and like, oh, I can take my guard down because nothing could possibly get through my barrier of intelligence, then you're the one who is like absolutely the perfect mark, maybe not for something like this, but for something else.
Yeah. And I think a lot of people also just don't understand the cognitive dissonance of being in a cult. And I feel like people who have not experienced that kind of cognitive dissonance, whether in a cult environment or in a different environment, can't understand how it feels. I think sometimes as cult survivors, we tend to understate our level of buy-in and focus on the doubts that we had at the time, because that feels like the only way to get outsiders to take us seriously and not write us off as being stupid. Like if you're talking to somebody with the same mentality that you described yourself having as a teenager, it is so much easier to say, oh, well, yeah, I never really believed it. You know, there were little pieces that I thought might be true, but I had doubts about everything the whole time. And I was always a rebel in my heart and blah, blah, blah. Because somebody with that mindset that you described yourself having as a teenager will take that seriously, where they would not take it seriously if you tried to explain how you can be 100% committed to something and still have doubts and questions and see the cracks at the same time.
Everybody, and I don't care who you are, if you're listening to this, you have some cognitive dissonance that you deal with in either your life or your, you know, in whatever it is that you do. If you are a person who is alive and thinking, then you deal with cognitive dissonance. And one of the things that a high control group will do is they will give you a lot of excuses and a lot of easy ways to explain away the cognitive dissonance and to get rid of it, so that it creates a full system in your head that all works with each other.
So related to Mr. Jones' experiment, it makes me wonder how many of his students were walking around the next week saying, well, I never really believed any of it. I knew it was a sham all along, and I just went with it to get a good grade.
I mean, that probably would have been me if I was in 10th grade, because I don't think I had the maturity at that point to be able to have that level of, I don't want to, is it self-awareness or self-somethingness that I don't think I would have been able to, have the maturity to say, oh, I actually am vulnerable to this. Mm-hmm. I actually did buy into this. And
I think in a group, it's likely that there were people who just never bought into it. Teenagers are,
I mean, he talked about people who didn't buy into it. There were the 3 young women who he said these were the smartest women in the class. These are the smartest girls in the class. And they saw what I was doing and they had a problem with it. And one of them told the rabbi and the rabbi called me.
Yeah. And teenagers are just notoriously skeptical and irreverent and don't take things seriously. So I am sure that there were people in the class who never took any of it seriously and did not internalize any of these rules or procedures of the third wave. And I'm sure that there were probably people who saw that and went along with it and went super hard on it to get a good grade. I think maybe the kid who yelled out in the end, "There isn't any leader, is there?" was maybe one of those kids. But I think in a typical group, there were probably a lot more kids who both bought in and had doubts. And when the whole thing fell apart, they fell back on the parts of themselves that doubted to protect themselves from the guilt of the parts of themselves that bought in. And this is a really challenging lesson for cult survivors because we do have to deal with that guilt. It's easy to kind of shrug it off and say, well, we always had doubts. We never fully believed it. And any harm that we did while we were members of this group was only what we had to do for ourselves to survive. I think it's a lot more powerful, though, and a lot more helpful to other people when we own up to the places where we did fully believe, when we make it clear that belief and doubt can coexist, especially in the mind of somebody who is being manipulated or being abused. And of course, when we actually make real apologies and do our best to make real amends for the harms that we know about that we did do while we were members. There are a lot of people who have stories that are a lot like mine. Like, I fully believed I did my very best and the system chewed me up and spit me out. Eric Skorzynski's story is really similar to mine. If you have heard any of his podcast episodes about his time on the mission field, we had a lot in common in Fundy Brain. And I think our stories are an incredibly powerful part of the narrative because we are part of the proof of what makes the IFB so toxic. I could save face by saying something like, no, I always knew that evolution really had to be true. Like, I'm smarter than that. I couldn't be fooled by creationist science books. But that's not the truth. The truth is that I always had a emotion and a feeling of doubt about the things I was being taught in science. I always felt like there was more out there that I couldn't quite understand and had a lot of questions. I was always curious about evolution, but I believed in creation. That is just what I believed. I don't want to invalidate anybody who has a different experience than I do, because there are people all over this spectrum and in places on the spectrum that we didn't even talk about in this little end cap to the episode. But I want to validate people who have a story that's more similar to mine and empower them to tell their stories too and be honest about what we experienced when it comes to belief and doubt. Sorry, that was kind of a tangent.
No, but that was very relevant, and I think that was a good note to end on.
Let me know if you find any, I would love to read follow-up from students who were in Mr. Jones' class. If any of them wrote something 20 years later.
Yeah. Thank you guys for tuning into this episode. Give us a follow on social media if you haven't followed us already. Our handle is @LeavingEden Podcast. You can follow me on social media at GAVRIELHACOHEN. Sadie?
You can follow me on Instagram at Sadie Carpenter Music, on Twitter at HellYeahSadie, and on TikTok at SadieCarpenter1.
Thank you guys so much for tuning in. You guys have a great day. Bye-bye.